Hello, and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the Avdiivka direction where the Russian forces got a foothold in the first few buildings within the village. The forces here are trying to advance into the village, try and gain control over it as the Ukrainian soldiers stand strongly and defend it, leaving only this small foothold as the only Russian gain. It can hardly be called a gain, but it is nonetheless. With this, we see that the Russian forces continue their pressure in the Kupyansk direction. There's been new rotations of forces on the Russian side. As such, there are new forces, fresh forces, and additional forces in this section of the front line. As such, the Russians are going to continue fighting in this direction and continue pressuring the Ukrainian side as the Ukrainians continue defending this area. It seems that the Ukrainian strategy continues as it was, and that is to defend every single square feet, not allowing a single advance by the Russian forces without a cost. The fighting here is on the Russian side an attempt to advance in the direction of Kupyansk and pressure the Ukrainian presence in this area. The reason why there's so much fighting with hardly any gains is that the Ukrainian forces have an axis of defense, which is this area between Andriivka, Pervomaiske, and Kupyansk. This triangle here, it's a right triangle, is the main defensive line in between the Ukrainian positions east of the Escalate river line and the Russian attempts at cutting that off. Without the connection here between Kupyansk and Pervomaiske, the Ukrainians will not be able to hold a position here to the east of the Escalate river line. As such, the Ukrainian forces have the majority of the defenders in this direction as they try to hold back the Russian forces. Whenever the Russians make an advance, they launch counterattacks to try and regain those positions. Multiple times the Russians have gotten a foothold within Andriivka, but have since been pushed out. This shows exactly how much fighting there is. Despite constant rotations on both sides, the fighting continues. We then move on to the Bakhmut direction, where first off we have this Russian advance to the southwest of Pervomaiske. We see that the Russian forces launched an attack in the direction of the car racing track, which they managed to capture. They also managed to capture this field here to the south of that racing track, this forest patch here, and more trenches here by the Pervomaiske road. So all of these advances took place yesterday as Russian forces continued pushing on to the Ukrainian positions. The Russians here are attempting to continue their advances through the road, capturing the Ukrainian fortified positions throughout the road as they have trenches everywhere moving in this whole direction. And the Russian forces are here attempting to gain control over the road and the fortifications to allow them to push onwards to Avdiivka and gain control over the road, to then push down south to Avdiivka. We see with these advances here to the west of Pervomaiske that this is not just in focus of the road, but also the forest lines and patches here to the north of Avdiivka to allow the Russian forces to then push directly from Bakhmut and from the Pervomaiske direction down south to Avdiivka to hit it from the north. If they manage to do that, they will also have the possibility of launching attacks from the east directly from Bakhmut here, and as such they would be attacking from the north and from the east. If they manage to gain success here to the north of Kupyansk as well, they can launch attacks from the south as well, leaving Avdiivka in a position where it's being attacked from three different sides. If they gain control over Kupyansk, they will also push westwards towards the canal and then increase the front line for Avdiivka to increase and include all areas all around it, leaving it in complete encirclement. In the Kupyansk direction itself, we see that the Russian forces have managed to put a lot of pressure on the Ukrainian forces with the capture of the fortified area here to the northwest of the village. As such, the Ukrainian forces were forced to pull back from their positions in the north of Kupyansk, both from the highlands and from the village itself. They still have positions here in the forest lines to the east of Kupyansk. This is why they still hold on to the highlands here to the east of the village, but the northeastern direction has been lost by the Ukrainian forces, and the fighting in the forest line continues as the Russians try to gain control over the area and push the Ukrainians out while capturing a few of them in the process, as is reported with some videos recorded from the area showing Russian soldiers storming Ukrainian positions and taking some capture while destroying others. We then move on to the Kupyansk direction, where the Russians have managed to regain full control over the village and push the Ukrainian forces back to the forest line. We see that the Ukrainians have this position here by the forest line, which is their first line of defense now that the Russians are on the offensive in this direction. There's also the fighting of the forest lines here to the south of Andriivka, which shows that the Ukrainians have not just positions here to the east of Klishivka, but also to the south of Andriivka. This is exactly what I mean when I talk about the fortifications here to the north of Klishivka. With this, the Russian forces can push westwards towards the canal, which would cut off these two positions of Ukrainian forces, as well as the ones by the forest lines right next to the canal. So all of these Ukrainian soldiers could be cut off completely if the Russians managed to successfully push westwards of Klishivka. However, we have seen no advances since the capture of the fortifications, which was now 11 days ago. Moving on to the Avdiivka direction, there's been no advances within the city itself or in the northern flank. However, on the southern flank, there's been advances reported to the southwest of Sheverne. This was reported by Deep State Map. They reported an advance by the Russian forces in the direction of Sheverne from the western direction. In my analysis yesterday, I did a look over the positions of Tonenke and Severne, where the Ukrainian forces have these positions as a twin village, where both of them are heavily fortified. The weakness is the small size of the villages. However, the strength is that they have every single angle covered, with the forest lines here to the south and to the west of the villages, both of them, as well as the location and placement and building size direction of these villages, allowing them to have heavy fortifications in these directions. The flank protected here to the northeast of Sheverne, with the weakness being in this northern direction, which is protected by the eastern flank of Tonenke. So all positions in this whole area is well protected by the natural barriers as well as fortifications the Ukrainians have built. The weakness of these positions is how small they are, as the Russian forces can just concentrate all of their explosives in these small areas, causing a lot of casualties among the Ukrainian positions. This is why their fortifications are very important to deny the effectiveness of artillery in, for example, trenches. As such, there's likely a lot of fortifications in preparation for the fighting taking place in this direction, which makes it difficult for the Russian forces to push against their positions. This is why we're seeing how the front line is becoming very wide, because the strength of the Russian forces would be if they, in large numbers and wide area, attack these positions all at the same time to prevent the Ukrainian forces to push back against their positions. The weakness of such a strategy would be the lack of concentration of forces, allowing them to be weaker on all sides compared to if they concentrated their forces. However, the strength is if one side manages to gain some success, they can reposition and reinforce that area to then push onwards. We also see some Russian advances in Vodiane against Pervomaiske, where we see that they've managed to cross over to the road here between Pervomaiske in the southern direction, the main part, and the northern direction. With this, we see continuous pressure by the Russian forces in the northern side of the river line. If they continue in this direction like this, the Ukrainian positions here to the southeast in the direction of the edges of Pervomaiske, the Russian forces could pressure them by flanking their positions from the north and from the south, forcing them to fall back, similar to the Klishivka case. With that, it's the end of the front line. We, however, move on to the political spectrum, where first off, Zelensky has detected some wiretapping in his offices and offices of his subordinates. He hinted that the wiretapping is a war, but did not specify who the war is exactly. He did gently criticize Zelensky's innovation on the mobilization and the change of military commissars, calling it a sabotage of the mobilization. With those comments, we can conclude that the conflict between Zelensky and Zelensky is entering into a new stage. And on that topic, there is a yearly survey in Ukraine where they ask about the trust in Zelensky's government, the military, and Zelensky himself. Zelensky in last year's polls was reported to have a trust of 84% of the population. This year it is down to 62%, so a drop of 22%. The government as a whole is down to 26% from 52% last year. The trust in the military is 96, exactly as it was last year, 96 out of 100, while the trust in Zelensky is 88%. This shows a much higher trust in both the commander-in-chief Zelensky and the military compared to the government and Zelensky. This is exactly why this conflict is happening. Zelensky feels his own position is threatened by Zelensky. As such, he is trying to get rid of that threat so he can continue as the political leader of Ukraine. The question here is, does Zelensky even have an interest in politics? That I cannot answer. As such, we end the video here. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.